Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to our speaker series. I'm really excited for this week's presentation with Friends of the Mad River. So I'm personally really excited to have Yes Tomorrow forming a bit of a partnership with Friends of the Mad River. I think it's a really amazing opportunity to bring a little bit more of the morrow of yestermorrow in regards to the environment and the climate and how to have resilient communities, which is something that's really important right now. So, Ira, were you going to start, or is Corrie going to start?
I will.
Corrie, awesome. Corrie, would you like to take it away from here?
Okay, give me one sec. I'm Corrie Miller. I work for Friends of the Mad River, and I'm here with Ira Shadis, who is my colleague at Friends of the Mad River. And I am just really glad to get to share this tonight. And he and I put a little bit of the story together, and that was fun. So we're really just going to share with you a little bit of a take on what we've been learning over the last 5 years and where we're headed and what some opportunities in your yards in the Mad River watershed are. So the mission of the Friends of the Mad River is to steward the healthy land and the clean water for our community now and for the community into the future, both for people and for wildlife. And we work on so many different projects and different programs, but we really think about it in 3 different ways. We work to learn about the health of the land and the watershed. We do work to conserve our natural resources, and we really try to focus, like this kid is by the river here in the photo, on celebrating this place that we live, and really appreciating the values that are all around us. And we work with community members. We work with municipalities, whether it's the select boards, the road crews, the planning commissions, the conservation commissions. But we also work with businesses and other people across the watershed. So with the next hour, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of what we've learned and where we're headed, and then Ira is going to talk with you about some opportunities on your yard. And we're open to questions, like Rachel was saying, and look forward to hearing anything people want to know. So I'm going to start with just a celebration of the quality of life that we have in the Mad River Valley. And there's so much about life here. And I think that, this has hit closer to home recently, at least for me, just being aware of this more often all day. But we have these beautiful vistas and this sort of aesthetic working landscape of fields and forests and farms and ski slopes and just this beautiful scenery all around us all the time. We have great outdoor opportunities in all seasons that just allow us to be outside in nature and really loving everything around us. We get to eat great food that is from here. We get to swim in what I feel like are pretty amazing crystal clear swim holes. And, they're not crystal clear all the time, but they are a lot of the time. And, these other things that come from natural assets like maple syrup and amazing beer from our clean water. So those are all things that we really appreciate about this place. And I won't belabor this, but there are some threats to this quality of life that I'm just going to mention a few that relate to our work at Friends of the Mad River. But one big one is big climate events. So if we certainly all remember, if you were here, Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. There was another huge storm in 1997 that impacted the sort of upper part of the watershed in Warren. But these events are really threatening our way of life. They're pointing out problems with our infrastructure, with the way that we do business, that are hard reminders for us. I think the other thing, though, is that those events are happening more and more frequently on a smaller scale. So this is a picture from my neck of the woods in North Fayston. And all of us who live in North Fayston, if we were here, we remember August 16th of 2016, when lots and lots of rain, I think about 5 inches of rain, fell overnight on our little subwatershed in about 2 or 3 hours, and caused hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage to the public infrastructure like the roads. And that's not even counting what private individuals experience. So we are getting these more persistent, more damaging events, and they're happening more regularly. And, there's also this other situation where even when it rains just a little bit, we have really problematic situations where a lot of sediment and a lot of pollution is running into the river with just a small event. So this is more, it's not just happening at those big climatic events, it's also now happening more and more regularly. And that's just due to the changing precipitation regime that we're experiencing. So some folks got together in 2015, about 20 people from the Mad River watershed went to what's called the Leahy Environmental Summit up at ECHO in Burlington. And they were interested and tasked by the ECHO folks to really think about how we could make our community more resilient to flooding and reduce our vulnerabilities. After the 2-day intensive conversation at ECHO, they had a lot of meetings, and we got together with a lot of different people and generated ideas and put a request into the High Meadows Fund to form what has become and what became the Ridge to River Initiative. And this is just a coalition that's still going on in the watershed 5 years later, that's for clean water and flood resilience. And the first task that was funded by the High Meadows Fund of this group was to think about our opportunities and our challenges with regard to flood resilience and clean water. And the folks at the meeting really thought that stormwater management was an area where they could focus and really think through how they could take the resilience of our community into their own hands. And the idea was really that, if we can slow down the water that's falling onto our planet, onto our watershed, and treat our properties like a sponge, we can sink it into the ground and we can be less vulnerable in those large rain events. So we can actually control how much we're affected. We don't have those perpetual maintenance problems. And we benefit from just really beautiful, clearer swimming holes and cleaner groundwater. So the idea that really resonated for folks who were at that meeting at the Leahy Summit and then started organizing around Ridge to River was that this is an opportunity for our community to not just take what's coming, but actually do something to improve the situation and be less vulnerable in these larger and more persistent regular events. So the task force came together. It had official town representatives from all 5 towns in the watershed, which, by the way, if you don't know, is Warren, Wadesfield, Baston, Duxbury, and Moortown, from the folks from the select board and planning commissions in each town. There were businesses like Sugar Bush and community participants. There were nonprofit partners. And due to that High Meadows Fund grant, we had some funding at first and even perpetual grants after that to hire some consultants and some researchers. And so we were trying to figure out where we have challenges as it comes to stormwater runoff in the watershed and where we have the opportunities to do something about it. And I'm just going to share with you a few of the things that we learned. We learned basically what we already knew, that roads are avenues for runoff. And so essentially, we learned some specifics about the situation for us, though, in the watershed. If you think about it, roads move people with the cars, but they also move water, and they become these really straight paths between pollution or sediment and the waterways. And we learned that in the watershed here, we have 437 miles of roads, and that's actually quite a bit in comparison to other places. Of those roads, 33% of them are privately managed. So these are the private driveways that people share, or private roads that people share and driveways. So if we think about those private roads, that there are 40% of them are on steep slopes. And that's really not a surprise to those of us who live here, who look around and see where the houses are and how many of them are on these steep hills. But it is another reason we're more vulnerable in flood events is that we have a lot of roads. Some of them are managed publicly and many are managed privately, and they're on steep slopes. And when you think about road densities, about half of the subwatersheds in the Mad River watershed have road densities that are equivalent to the outer Chittenden County towns like Jericho and Richmond. So we think that we're kind of rural here and we're out in the middle of nowhere, but actually we have a pretty big road network. So then aside from roads, we also learned that we are losing forest cover. So what we know is that between 2001 and 2011, this watershed lost 500 acres of forest cover. And we don't know what caused that. We don't know. We just are looking at land cover data, and forest cover was either converted to developed land, which that's pretty clear what's happening, or it was converted to herbaceous land, and that's less clear what was happening. Um, you might wonder why that matters. And essentially, there's a lot of pretty good research, some of it that's most significantly related to our community that's out of the Pacific Northwest, that anytime you hit sort of that 65% or less forest cover threshold in a subwatershed, you end up with quite a bit of damage. You start to hit a lot of damage downstream. So streams become unstable, properties start to get flooded, there's a lot more erosion. Things are just much more unstable in the whole watershed when you don't have that natural buffer of forest cover that can help hold on to water and protect the stability of the system. We did some research to try to figure out, just sort of anecdotal and qualitative research to try to figure out where all this forest loss was coming from. And we talked to DRBs, so the development review boards in towns, the zoning administrators, the planning commissions, the administrators in the towns, the select boards, and pretty much a lot. What came out of those conversations was that there is a pretty solid anecdotal evidence that this is people clearing for views, or clearing just a little bit more lawn, or just sort of cleaning up their back 40. So we have this sort of small dispersed change happening. And essentially, another thing that sort of makes this matter is that we think about Vermont as being pretty strong on environmental regulations. And we think about that, I think, partly because of Act 250. But what is the primary kinds of development that are happening here in this watershed are not going to Act 250. The primary development in this watershed is 1 and 2 person structure, 2 family structures, and that's not going to trigger stormwater permits at the state level that are under Act 250. So there's really not state regulation for any kind of runoff from a property. The other thing that really plays into this is that the municipal regulations that do play into these properties that are the development that's happening here, they do a really good job. They do a really good job of protecting sort of the on-site construction runoff that happens during the project's construction, like these silt fences that you see in this picture. But they do not consider, or they're limited in their consideration of what happens over the long term when more and more land is developed, and they don't require any mitigation of runoff that's from new impervious surfaces. So as you create more and more surfaces that are impervious, like driveways and lawns to some extent, roofs, porches, all of these things that add up across the landscape cause more and more runoff problems. And there's not really a local control for that with the development. On the good side of things, we learned that people here really care. We surveyed about 200 people, and all of them care about clean water. I think we are really, as folks know who've spent any time here, we're a community connected to our swim holes. We are connected to this river, and we feel defined by it. We know that we understand stormwater, and people really are aware, and they understand what pollution is, what runoff is, what sediment is, and people are trying to do something. But what they reported overall was that they are limited by their resources and by their skills. So they need either more information or more money to make some of these changes that are important happen. So the moral of the story is that these small dispersed problems that we're noticing across the watershed, roads, forest cover, some development challenges, can add up to a lot of damage when you collectively look at it. But so can small and important dispersed good things. So we're trying to look across the watershed and see where we can collect good acts with regard to stormwater and add up to a really great change. So the Ridge to River group came back after all this learning and created what they called an action framework. It's available on our website. It really looks at the different projects that people identified as important to building this flood resilience and clean water through better stormwater management. And I'm just going to share a few of those areas. We started calling it Storm Smart because just sort of in thinking about being prepared for storms. There is this thing called a stormwater master plan that the state does. It sounds kind of boring, but it actually is looking at any kind of scale, a really small scale of a site, all the way up to a watershed scale, and looks at opportunities within that site to really sink water into the ground or disperse the challenge that water is causing when it is on the landscape. So we've done a few of these projects. This is the Warren Schools subsurface chambers. So these are chambers that are made for letting water, give it more time to infiltrate into the ground, and they're under the parking lot at the Warren School. And that came after doing a stormwater master plan at the school that identified both this stormwater infrastructure and this other, which is a rain garden that's draining, allowing the roof runoff from the school to be piped into this rain garden and filtered before it is back into the groundwater. This is Fuller Hill Road in Warren, and this is a site where we also did a stormwater master plan with the town of Warren. And the problem before this project was done was that the road is steep and it goes right down to the main street and to the river, and it was always washing all kinds of stuff across the road and into the river. And what happened here is that they use this feature called a dry well that you bury into the ground. It has this catch basin. The water just is able to sit in the dry well. It's porous. It is allowed to drain. So this site, I think, has I always forget the number, but either 11 or 13 of these dry wells all the way up the hill in the ditch line. So now, after a rain event, you don't even see anything on Main Street where you used to see all kinds of sediment and all kinds of other things. So these are some success stories. This is a rain garden at Harwood Union that's also, it's outside by the middle school classrooms, where students also have an outdoor classroom and they can measure some of the water samples, and it's obviously really great habitat for butterflies also. So last year, we also finalized a town-wide stormwater master plan for each of the 5 towns in the watershed. So now, and actually with the Mount Ellen also, we have 28 30% engineering plans, the most priority sites that a group of stakeholders identified in each of the towns. So we're really trying to advance these projects along the trajectory from sort of identifying where they should be with the stakeholders, figuring out what the priorities are with those same stakeholders, and then engineering these 30% designs, eventually the 100% designs, or some of these 30% designs can go straight to build, like a design build situation. So they're all in various stages of sort of on the shelf versus in process for getting funded versus in process for actually implementing right now. But the exciting news is that there's a lot of work to be done, and we know what it is. Another thing we've been doing is working with municipalities to be more storm smart. And the road roundtables that we've been organizing, I think for the last about 3 years, have been really successful. These have been opportunities. We basically get all 5 town road crews together to talk and share ideas and techniques and challenges, and think about ways they can work together, think about ways that they can advocate for what they need at the state level together. And it's just been a really important way for the select boards to learn what the road crews need, and the road crews to learn what the pressures the select boards are dealing with. So we've had about 8 of these so far, and pretty fun times with lots of coffee. So the last thing I'll share is the private road assessment that we did. And we basically learned there are lots of shared private private road networks in this watershed. And many of them don't have homeowner associations and don't really have any way aside from plowing and an occasional grading, that they manage their road networks. And some of them are on very, very steep slopes and have lots of problems. So we are trying to crack this nut a little bit because there's no state funding for this kind of work that's on private land. But we were able to get a non-state grant to work with landowners at some of these sites. And we're trying to figure this out and how we can make it happen. But I'm going to come back to the moral and just say what I think a second moral of the story is. And that is that these small dispersed changes across the landscape can add up to a lot of good. And it's going to take homeowners too. And that's where the origin of our Storm Smart program that Ira is going to talk with us about is. And we publicly call it just Storm Smart, but in this, we're calling it Storm Smart Homes and Drives. And it's basically about making sure that homeowners are involved in this process. Because if we think about the watershed and where all of, what makes up the watershed, certainly people's properties and residential areas are a large portion of that. And so it takes homeowners too to make this collective change across the landscape. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ira. And thanks so much.
Okay. So I'll just reintroduce myself briefly. So my name is Ira Shadis. I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Friends of the Mad River. I work on a number of different things, but the sort of meat of my work is this Storm Smart program, working particularly with private property owners, property managers, and homeowners throughout the valley. And so I am often trying to answer this question in partnership with these homeowners. How can we really make your home storm smart? And I'll say that, I'll reiterate a lot of the points that Corrie made, but sort of the work before I came on really laid the groundwork and the ideas that we rely on about these small changes adding up, spongifying the landscape, and so on. So to reiterate, I will say, we are looking for these opportunities to slow down rainwater and snow melt, and really to sink it into the ground for all of the reasons that Corrie has already mentioned. And then we also talk about some of the co-benefits, and I'll touch on those throughout this as well. But a lot of the projects that we aim to plant, Corrie mentioned that rain garden being good for butterflies. There are many benefits that thinking holistically about water in the landscape can have for the community. So just to show you our little animation here, but the idea is that each property in the valley has its own sort of characteristic, and so there's going to be different strategies and different approaches to sort of spongify it. And so that might mean planting trees, water bars, rain barrels, but all of it has the same goal of trying to get that water to sort of soak into the ground or really be absorbed by the vegetation. And so it reduces its downstream impact. So the watershed is generally where we work, and that's what we're bound by. And I put these slides in here because I wanted to show, this is our watershed, and this is just a sampling of the assessments that we have done over the last 2 years since 2018. I've been doing this work, and at this point, all these little trees and storm clouds would probably be more than doubled. And so you can see the watershed itself really is comprised, as Corrie said, of private property in large part. And if we really collectively find opportunities to sink water in the ground, we can cover a lot of area and make a big difference watershed wide. So fundamentally, Storm Smart, whether it's in the formation of the ridge to river, or whether it is in these homeowner assessments or working with the road crews, it's a community-based program. Certainly Corrie and I do our fair amount of work, but we couldn't get anywhere without the partnerships and the knowledge and the capacity that this community brings, and the value that they have for things like clean water and flood resilience. We need that partnership. So we root ourselves in the community, and everything we do starts with the individual people and their participation and their values. So specifically, this homeowner program begins with homeowners sort of seeing the advertising or the communications that we put out there and thinking that they would like to start the conversation with us. So we put out the invitation and people respond. And they come to us for a number of reasons. They might have erosion on their property that they're trying to puzzle through and figure out. They might be interested in just being good neighbors and making a difference downstream. They might really care a lot about water quality, flood resilience, and they might want to support biodiversity. To this point, we have found that tree planting, which is a relatively simple practice, can have this really big impact, particularly when we're thoughtful about the kinds of trees that we choose. And so, a native species of oak might host 400 different species of moth, and so that kind of co-evolution between native insects and native trees can have this great benefit for biodiversity. And then people are curious, and curiosity is a great motivator. And I think that having another set of eyes on a property and exploring the way water moves through it, it can just be great to have the opportunity to hash things out. And that hashing out is sort of at the core of this program. So I am going to walk us through what is a Storm Smart assessment. And the Storm Smart assessment is the time where I meet up with the property owner together. We look at their property, and I learn from them, and I try and provide what kind of insight I can. It's sort of it's our free program that's at the heart of a lot of this this private property work that we're doing. So again, we start with a person. We start with a homeowner who is interested, someone who's living somewhere in the valley. And then we meet up at their property, and so you can kind of see the whole picture here, which is someone who is interested in some way in stewarding their piece of property in the watershed. And so I always start the assessment process by asking what the homeowner is seeing on their property. They have expertise. They are they have local knowledge, very particular. And when you look closely at the valley, you can see it has a very complicated geology, a sort of rich natural history. Every single property is going to have its own story, which means that it's also going to have its own challenges and its own opportunities. And in many cases, property owners are going to have the best insight into what's happening at the property. So in this case, the property owner saw signs of erosion on the driveway. They see these little streams and rivulets forming. They had more driveway than they needed. They had a large parking area that was more than they needed for their particular cars. And it was not, I think, the most fun space to hang out in front of their house. They also had some drainage issues that are interesting in that once we get on the site, I'm looking holistically at the way water is moving through the property. And so while we might emphasize things like rain barrels and rain gardens and green roofs and things like that, if someone has a cracked foundation drain pipe that's leading to water in their basement, that's something that I've seen 70, 80 different properties, and there's some insight that I can provide there. And then when the work to replace something like this is being done, we can hopefully do it in a way that is a little bit more sustainable and can help absorb the water instead of, as was the case here, sending the water right into a brook at the edge of the property. So I'll also say this is a very wet property. This to the right of this picture is the uphill, and there's was a previously existing swale here that was absolutely fundamental in keeping even more water from running down the hill into the basement. It intercepted it, but because this is a great example of a swale, because it was broad and shallow and well vegetated, a lot of the water that ended up in it was able to sink into the ground or transpire through the plants that were there. So then, in conjunction with what they see, the property owner has their own values, and there's things that they're interested in either having happen on the property or making happen in the watershed. And so in this case, the property owner was really interested in using native plants for the work that they hope to do, which is something I am also always very interested in. So that was a great common ground. They wanted less lawn and addition, less driveway maintenance. So they wanted to sort of find ways to use the sort of perennial nature of native plants to reduce the amount of work they have to do. And then these are folks who have this is, I believe, their second home, but they've been coming up here for years and years, and I think they've actually moved up full time relatively recently, and they value this community, and so the opportunity to be neighborly and to have that downstream impact and benefit for the community was an appeal as well. So then I'm there as well. So what do I look for? It's opportunities. There are often issues. I pointed to the erosion that might draw people to the program as well. But I'm really trying to look with the landscape level perspective and think, okay, what is the opportunity here to slow spread and sink in the water where it lands? So I might consider, projects like dry wells. I also consider the opportunities to support and mimic natural systems as much as possible. There's a lot of great research out there that indicates that the sort of relatively natural, lightly managed landscape actually does a great job absorbing the impacts of storms. I recently read that 100 trees in the Northeast over the course of a year will absorb 100,000 gallons of water, 100 mature trees, right? So mature trees require time for sure. And so if we can support the natural systems that are already in place, they'll pay dividends in the years to come. Similarly, projects like rain gardens are a great opportunity to use native species and native plants that also provide benefits for pollinators. And so you get that sort of cascade of habitat and biodiversity benefits, which is, I will also say, just to harp continually on this point of native plants, when we use native plants, we almost always find that we have more stable, deeper root systems, and that we also have a more textured sort of landscape. The plants will sort of grow up, they'll provide benefits to a variety of species, from insects to small mammals, birds, and so on. And in Vermont and in any place you go, the native plants have often co-evolved with a number of species. And so you really are, you protect one, you add one of these, native plants to your property, to your rain garden, and you also then might benefit another indigenous species. And so for all of this, though, these are high level thoughts. I also am trying to find what are practical solutions to some of the more traditional things that we might see on the property. So I often end up spending a fair amount of time looking at things like the driveway and culverts and drainage ditches and seeing, how has the maintenance been going on, asking the homeowner what their maintenance plan, helping them come up with one, and trying to come up with opportunities and solutions that are reasonable for the homeowner. So once we've sort of gone through this assessment process, we've walked the property, we've taken a look at things. The question is then, how do we actually go forward and address these challenges and opportunities? So the next step for the Storm Smart program is to provide written recommendations, a map, some diagrams, and some other resources that can kind of sort of deepen the homeowner's understanding of some of the practices that we might use to slow spread and sink water, things like the rain garden and the rain barrel. So in this property, this is each participant in the Storm Smart assessment gets a sort of map of their property. And so, you can kind of match up the key here and see that, this is what I recommended, was that they could have a low mow zone to sort of reduce their mowing and allow for the ground vegetation there to mature and deepen its roots and provide some habitat. There were some tree planting opportunities on the property to stabilize the swale and to stabilize the bank at the sort of downhill edge of the parking area. We had talked, the homeowner and I had talked very directly about the idea of reducing the overall driveway size size and what that might look like and what we might replace it with. And then in orange, you can see there was an existing infiltration trench that I had mentioned with the sort of broken drain pipe or underground pipe. And so that was a project they were planning on doing already. But that's something that sort of matches what we often talk about is, how do we take that water from the rooftop and get it to sink into the ground sort of right away? And then, because we don't want flooding in our basement, how do we sustainably direct it away from the property? And then in addition, things like rain barrels and water bars, are tools to just sort of slow down and break up that spread of water and direct it somewhere potentially more sustainable, maybe like a garden. So just some details of some of that stuff.
Hey, Ira,
yeah.
we have a question in regards to examples of native plants that are good at erosion prevention on steep slopes.
I wish I was a better horticulturalist and could answer that off the top of my head. There's a number of resources that I tend to rely on as opposed to keeping that information up there. So I think probably the best way for me to answer that is if someone wants to get in touch with me, I could certainly connect them to some of those resources. It's, it generally depends, I would say, on what they would like to have, whether they want to have something like a tree or a shrub or something more like a grass or something like that. Because each one of them can stabilize to some degree, but they will, they'll have a different aesthetic and a different appeal.
Perfect. So it depends. That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll just say to get back to the detail, and you can see here I selected truffula trees from Dr. Seuss to be on the bank of this swale, but just as another opportunity as water flows into the swale to sort of to suck it up into the base of the trees. And check dams similarly give the water a chance to sort of pool and reduce the energy of it flowing. So you can see the same, that stabilization with our truffula trees on the edge of this driveway. So, these were the recommendations I provided. The homeowner and I, we talked through them, and a big part of the Storm Smart program that I work with is this dialogue, this back and forth of trying to figure out what works, and what resources are missing or there, or what kind of support we can continue to provide. And in this case, it was just sort of some more planning and being present for the process of trying to bring these recommendations into reality. And so the property owner ended up working with a local landscape design architect to come up with some more specific and detailed plans. And as you can see, it's a little different than the plans I had suggested. But if we look closely at this, we can see that the principles are essentially the same. It's the use of native plants. It's a rain garden. It's reducing the size of the driveway. So I worked with the homeowner and the landscape designer to sort of hash out some of these details. And then we get to work. And so on this property, the property owners actually did a fair amount of work themselves. This is a great example of them diligently transferring sod from an area that we had pulled it up to put in a new garden bed to this steep slope on the new driveway, so that they could stop the erosion that might occur. And because this property involved moving the driveway essentially from one side to the other, it did require some larger machines to be brought in. And these guys did this work, I think, the big machines anyways, did their part of the project in about a day and a half. And they were able to reduce the driveway by more than half and establish this new, shorter, less steep driveway section, install a new culvert, establish a very nice wide swale. We seeded it, and I've been past there this summer, and the plants are coming in nicely, and the driveway is looking great. So I added this other diagram here just to highlight that that in addition to the work in front of the house and the sort of commitment to some of the low mow zones that the homeowner did take on, there was this infiltration trench that was reestablished. And we actually moved the outlet drain farther uphill and put in a number of sort of water-friendly plants that could handle the outflow of water and act as a buffer between the outflow and the stream. But I have not been back yet to photograph that, and I hope to get there this summer. So I'll just quickly go through some of the direct on-site benefits from this work that was done. We reduced the impermeable surface of the driveway, therefore reducing the amount of runoff and the risk of erosion directly on the property. We increased the plant cover, which is something that the homeowner had hoped to have, similar with the native habitat and biodiversity. It was the end. I think they did this work in June, and by August, I went back and I have a bunch of great video footage of butterflies and insects and all these things right there on the native species. It was really cool to see. There's direct infiltration in the middle of this diagram. Sort of just in front of the house, there's an area that is actually a rain garden that allows water to sink directly into the ground, much like a dry well. As the plants mature, so this is not quite true yet, but there will be some noise reduction and some privacy from the road that these new plants will provide. And then with the work with the infiltration trends, the basement water was reduced and hopefully resolved for the long run. Overall, in the watershed, the reduction in sediment, pollutant, and transport is very real. Prior to this, the driveway had that erosion, and you could see the sediment would go down through the roadside ditch and right into the brook. There's a significant buffer now on both sides of the driveway of vegetated material and grass that can help slow down and take that sediment out of the transportation process. And then, as Corrie mentioned, we face these storms and these microburst storms, and everything that we can do on an individual property to absorb that water, to reduce the peak flow and create more of a buffer benefits the entire watershed's flood resiliency. And then, of course, wildlife habitat. Connecting it again to something like climate change, one of the most important steps to take in trying to preserve biodiversity in the long run is to have connected stretches of forest and ecologically stable and diverse landscapes. And so even something like your yard that is then turned into sort of native forest and native shrubland can act as a wildlife corridor for all sorts of animals and allow them to adapt to the changing environment around them. So I'll just go through a couple of before and after here's as we get towards wrapping this up. So this is what the property looked like to begin with. The driveway, if you're facing the house, is on the right side, a large parking area, some relatively unprotected banks on the ditch. And so it looks quite different here, and we're slightly to the right, but we're looking at where the driveway used to go. This is exactly where it was. So it had been brought down and the area had been planted and the bank stabilized as these plants were put in. So this is the new driveway, and we can see the grass that the homeowners put in took very nicely. It's one of the most impressive sod transplants I've ever seen. And we can also see to the left side of the photo, there's some stones sticking out of the sod. And that is a sort of energy diffuser from a drainage sort of path of stone that's just out of view behind that bush. But it empties into there, and having these stones in there allows the water to strike them and sort of disperse more gently into this grassy slope and reduce the risk of erosion there. We can see the rain garden here in front of the house. The middle patch that's sort of empty there, they had not yet filled in, but it's a walkway, so there's stone in there now. But this is a slight depression on both sides, and all these plants are both water and drought tolerant, which is important for rain gardens. And they intercept a significant amount of the water that comes off of the roof, as well as the slope of the driveway. They try to direct it so that a fair amount of water goes in here as well. So, as Corrie said, each the small changes add up, and I would add to that because each property has its own character, you might find yourself saying, "Oh, I could put in this huge rain garden or a cistern," but you might just have a small patch of lawn where you plant some service berries, or you plant an oak tree that in 80 years time will be a vital piece of habitat. And so, the idea that we can each sort of, no matter how small, take a step and make an impact collectively across the landscape is very real. And I see it as I go from property to property throughout our field season. So over the last 2+ years, I've done over 70 assessments on properties. There are many opportunities, small to large, low-mow zones, rain barrels, driveway maintenance, even things like cleaning out your culverts in the springtime can have this large impact. Imagine if you don't clean out your culvert, it washes out, sends the sediment material from a washout down to the next culvert, and it can actually act like dominoes. And it can seem like such a small thing uphill, but it really does make a big difference. And increasingly, I'll just point out that we're looking a lot at sort of forest and riparian restoration to sort of come back to that natural systems approach. And so, there's if you live in the very high headwaters, you can really increase the sponge, and as the snow melt comes down and the rain comes down, you can be that buffer for downstream neighbors. And then if you live down on one of the tributaries or on the main stem, there's almost certainly opportunities to try and reintegrate some of the natural riparian buffers and floodplains that have existed and buffered the valley in the past. So that said, if you're interested, you can email me, and like I said, it's a free program. I'm happy to schedule a time to come out and take a look at you with your property. I can answer questions over the phone, so on. And then you can visit our website. We have a lot of good material on there for you to learn more. And that is the end of my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Ira. Get my video back on. Hi. Cool. So we'll wait for a little bit, see if anybody has any questions. I wonder actually, what's your dream vision for the valley? Either one of you or both of you can answer.
I have an anecdotal thing that I'll say, because it really does color a lot of what I think about. And it's not for the whole valley, but it's really been striking me this summer. I've been thinking a lot about upland wetlands and the tributaries and the way that those structures historically, and if you look at areas in all this sort of natural history research, where you can look into it and see that you get these sort of little plateaus throughout the valley, these little steps where water has the chance to spread out. And I would love to see whether it's through the participation, or ideally it's through the participation and working with property owners to sort of reconstruct, in a sense, some of that sort of wetland dynamic at these different steps across the valley, and really get up to the level that we may have seen historically several thousand years ago.
I want to dream too.
Please do, Corrie.
No, I just, one thing I think a lot about when we were shaping this program, and, with the Ridge to River folks that envisioned it, it was that neighbor to neighbor connection. And I think we're really trying to help people see that, well, let me back up. Rivers, for a long time, it's clear that downstream is impacted by upstream. To people who live along rivers, I think that people have started to see that. But I think what we're trying to do with this program is just also this sort of neighborly sense around who's uphill and downhill, and how you might impact each other in that way. And so at the Ridge to River task force level, we've talked a lot about how what happens in Warren really can impact the community of Moortown, and how it's the responsibility of the two to work together as neighbors to really understand that we're all in this together. And I think that's also true at the smaller scale that Ira is working with on private roads, and just whoever's above you on the hill can really impact how your experience of your property. And so just kind of promoting a different kind of neighborliness as it relates to water is my big dream.
guys both have really good dreams.
I'll just stick on there, if anyone in the group is thinking about it, like I have worked with groups of homeowners on multiple occasions, and I'm more than happy to come out. Like this last week, I had two different properties that shared a private road together, and I met with both of them, looked at their individual properties, talked to them about the private road and opportunities there. And so I second what Corey's saying. I think there's a real neighborliness to thinking about the water that moves through the landscape.
That's really awesome. I know I took permaculture for regional planning last year at Yes Tomorrow, and it was all about like, you got to think at the watershed level. Anything you do, just think of it at the watershed level. And it really was a big shift for me, just in how I move about my life, really.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any questions coming in, which means that you guys just did a really awesome job presenting your information. And maybe they're all just maybe they're just all busy emailing Ira to get their Storm Smart assessment. And I can, Ira, would you mind putting up your contact information again so I can put it in the Facebook chat? Awesome. If you could leave it up for a second, and then we actually do have a question. What are the next steps for Storm Smart? For the program. It's from Britain.
Ira, you want me to take it, but you're on mute.
I mean, yeah, we have several next steps. I think that you have a good grasp of it. If you want to answer, I could answer as well, I think.
Sure. So I think right now we've got this assessment piece down. Ira's, as he said, been at 70-ish sites, and that is something that we found pretty sufficient funding for at the state level and with private funders. Where we're hitting a kink is that helping private landowners do the work on their properties, because often what needs to get fixed is expensive. And so we're trying to figure out how to add resilience into landowners' sort of infrastructure across the watershed in a way that's cost sharing, or helping people overcome some of the barriers that they have. And that, I think, we're focusing on implementation. And as you folks at Yes Tomorrow know, we're trying to figure out also how to bring the training for all of the contractors, bring them to stormwater techniques. So kind of the people that are moving earth, and the people that are landscape architects, and the people that are thinking through all of this, that really important design work, making sure that that stormwater is top of mind, and that they have some of the expertise around how to handle it with green solutions as opposed to just pipes and pavement. Did I get everything, Ira?
Yeah, I was gonna say that we've also been working with the Friends of the Winooski and the Winooski Natural Resource Conservation District, and they're going to sort of replicate the work that we're doing here in the Mad River Valley watershed, in the whole Winooski watershed outside.
So we're busy. Ira's training people on how to do assessments.
Yeah,
that's fun.
Yeah. And then I guess the other very immediate next step is that we're doing assessments this summer. We're up and running, so spread the word. I have to guess like somewhere around a third of the people that interact with me it's word of mouth. So if, even if you're, in the chat and you're listening, you're like, well, I don't know if I want, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, there's an they might be interested. And I think that, it's even just people talking about these ideas is sort of a win in my book.
Awesome. That's great. Wow, so much good information. I feel like I already, had quite an intro speaking with you guys a couple months ago, but I feel like every time there's another little gem that sticks with me. It makes me want to own a property so I can have you do a Storm Smart assessment on it.
Yeah, just
Careful what you wish for.
slip the link into your next rent check.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to meet in this funny virtual way and share a little bit about what you're doing at Friends of the Mad River. Next week, same time, same place, we're going to talk with Eddie Murma from Sculpture School, which will be awesome, talking about his youth design build program. So, and then that's it for our spring, which has now turned to summer speaker series. But again, thank you guys so much. And I look forward to seeing you guys around doing different assessments and seeing you on campus at Yes Tomorrow at some point.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's a pleasure.
Bye. Have a good night.